Hi everyone, I'm Michelle King, and I'll just start with an acknowledgement of country. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, all of the different lands where we meet today, and pay our respects to elders past and present, and particularly extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and guests who are present today. And welcome everyone who has an interest in the work of CP Achieve, and in particular, well, my work, which was not part of CP Achieve, but I've been involved as a consumer representative on a range of CP Achieve projects, and I'm finishing up my doctorate. In fact, I have about less than 2 weeks to go before I have to hand it in. So you'll forgive me if I burst into tears at any time during this presentation. Just kidding, I'm fine. And my work is on the transition to adulthood for people with severe and profound intellectual disabilities. And I am this is a doctorate in law, but I am a sociologist by trade and a lawyer by accident. So I work in disability law and particularly look at how laws apply in practice for people in a range of different groups. And my doctoral work has been at the Australian Centre for Health Law Research, and there's some contact details for me there if you're interested. I might just, apparently it does not want to go to the next slide. There we go. Just on the topic of how I ended up in this area, I researched something that's very close to my own experience. I'm a parent of a young woman who's now 23, who has profound intellectual and multiple disabilities, including quadriplegic cerebral palsy, and she has athetoid CP, which is fluctuating she has both tonic high tone and the traditional athetoid. They used to call it writhing, but that's not such a great word, caused by an underlying genetic brain malformation called lysencephaly. So she is 23 now, and during the period of the 6 long years during which I was doing my doctorate, she went through the transition into her adult life. So she turned 18. And this is, of course, quite a difficult time for people who lack what mostly in law is called legal capacity, legal decision-making capability, which often can go hand in hand with some forms of cerebral palsy, depending on how the CP came about. So hence the topic today, and talking with you all through CP Achieve. So yes, my research is quite close to my heart. That's a picture of Dale there. That's in her final year at school. And a picture of her on the beach, which to me sums up a lot about the difficulties of accessibility for people who use wheelchairs for mobility. And I love that little picture. I often try to include it. It was drawn by my youngest daughter, who always drew Dale with as if she was sitting down. So that's Dale up in the top corner there, because she sits in her wheelchair, and I just think that's very adorable. And a quote, I guess, that sums up my work and has been influential in my life is from the philosopher Eva Kate, and I use a fair bit of her work in my doctorate. That is, even if philosophy whitewashes disability and passes over children such as ours with their impairments, with the special care they require, their lives direct us to the point and purpose of philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom. Eva Kate has a profoundly disabled child as well, and is quite influential in the area of moral philosophy around the personhood and capabilities of young people with very profound intellectual impairments. So I really recommend her work to everybody. If you haven't already come across it, she has an amazing book called Love's Labour, which is specifically about caring work. Okay, now, oh, it's working now, great. Just a quick note on terms. I tend to use the term severe and profound intellectual disability, or PIMD, which is profound and multiple disabilities. And I know that terminology can be difficult and does fluctuate depending on what specific things that you're looking at, whether you're looking particularly through a kind of more medical lens or whether you're looking at an inclusion lens. There's a whole lot of factors involved here. Also in the UK, they use learning difficulties to sort of represent intellectual disability. So it can be quite complex when you're looking at all the different work in this field. So I just wanted to make a note that I use the term profound intellectual disabilities usually. And for me, that's grounded on two key aspects about, I guess, what might be called cognitive capacity, which is a terrible way of putting it. That is around understanding and communication. So it's about the level of understanding that a person can actually have about the various things in the world around them, be they simple or complex, and whether or not that's able to be communicated. And here I'm really referring to people who have profound impairments to both aspects, because of course people can have profoundly impaired communication but not have an intellectual disability at all. So I just want to make that clear that I'm really talking here about people who have significant impairments to their ability to understand the complexities of legal and administrative decision-making in their lives. And I'm not talking about mild or moderate intellectual disabilities where someone can be supported to make decisions in those aspects of their lives. I'm talking particularly about children like mine, where Dale is lacks what we could call functional communication. So cannot purposefully, for example, ask for a drink of water, doesn't have the capacity to understand what a bank is, for example, let alone to give meaningful direction about how she might like banking done. And I guess at a practical level, that usually is accompanied by requiring assistance with all aspects of daily life. So everything from bathing, dressing, food, transport, just all aspects of life usually require assistance at this level of severity. And in particular, for my purposes, requiring significant assistance with administrative and legal decisions, and in fact, having a decision maker make those decisions. This is a bit of a diagram of probably something I'm not going to talk to in much detail, but in my doctorate, I have quite a significant section underlying the philosophy about defining personhood, and how that has sometimes excluded people with very severe intellectual impairments. And I make an argument for distinguishing the foundational nature of personhood from someone's cognitive capacity. And I guess I argue that that is better termed citizenship. And citizenship here is not so much in the sense of I'm an Australian or an American, it's more being able to act in the civic field. So being a kind of a legal actor, having legal agency, and being able to perform the functions that you need to perform inside civic life. Inside that circle, so each of these circles kind of narrow down, and the difficulties become more and more acute and, for my purposes, interesting to my topic. So inside everyone who can be regarded as a legal actor, in most legal systems, there's a requirement for the person to be of a certain age, which is why adulthood is interesting. Here in Australia, as we all know, that's 18 years, and it can be earlier for certain types of legal actions, and there's different regulations about that. For example, you can legally drive earlier than 18. You can legally marry another person who is also under 18 if you fulfill certain obligations. And there are some significant milestones in administrative life that happen earlier than 18. And I'm thinking here particularly around Medicare privacy, which happens here at 14. And of course, there's kind of more technical requirements around criminal law and being held criminally responsible for your actions, which can happen at any stage from about 10 years of age in Queensland. But clearly, the difference in adulthood, legally speaking, is that when you're under 18, you have to have your capacity to make the decision demonstrated. When you're over 18, you have to have your incapacity demonstrated. That is, it's assumed that you have capacity to take an action. When you're under 18, it's kind of mostly assumed that you do not have capacity. So that's the kind of swing in meaning, legally speaking, that happens during adulthood. And of course, that transition is very complex and difficult for people who might have impairments to their legal agency and legal capacity. So adulthood is the bigger circle. Inside that, we've got the idea of legal capacity and legal autonomy. And autonomy underlies basically all of law in Western systems. So in Western systems, we make an assumption that individuals have legal autonomy, they act individually, and they can be held responsible for their actions. We also have rights that attach to that, but here I'm more interested in the idea of responsibility. So if you do something in a certain setting, if you pay money or sign a contract or take a kind of action, I'm interested in whether you personally can be held responsible for that. And that's where legal capacity comes in. Inside the idea of legal capacity are the recent developments around decision-making and supported decision-making in particular. Now in Queensland, we have quite a complex and relatively new way of looking at that. And it does differ between the states, just to add just that extra slice of complexity for everybody. Mostly trying to push our ideas about someone's decision-making capacity to a support model rather than a substituted model. And how successfully each of the jurisdictions do that is probably a matter for a whole other topic. The important thing here is that, for example, in Queensland, where I live and the law that I used in my work, there is an assumption that decision-making will be substituted if at the very end where you get to, and the substituted decision maker is what you would usually call a guardian or administrator here. Now, this is a very complex area of law and it's evolving. Victoria, for example, has moved a lot further towards supported decision-making. And even in Queensland, we do have supported decision-making principles. And one of the reasons I'm interested in supported decision-making versus substituted is because I really call for, in my work, a recognition that there are people where fundamentally you cannot support them to make a legally recognised decision. That is, there is a level of impairment, for example, in intellectual disability, and also what is sometimes in law called the hard cases. So people with very advanced dementia or people experiencing particularly severe psychotic episodes, for example, who are unable to be supported to make a decision. And effectively then we're looking at substitution. And I guess part of my work is the importance of recognising that inside our systems. So I hope my little circles show how it narrows right down and also how it can expand back up. So if you are interested in severe and profound intellectual disability, that population, even though it's quite small, can also tell us something interesting about law and society's ideas about all of the circles as they expand. So if we know more about what happens at this level, we can also learn more about what happens, how we have these ideas of legal capacity and autonomy and what adulthood means and why it has various things attached to it in law, and then what it means to be a citizen inside of society. And ultimately, what we think of when we think of who is a person and why. So it's both narrows and expands. So I hope that makes sense. I like my circles. Okay. Oh, this is another picture of Dale. Look how adorable she is. This is very brief on my method, so I won't talk to it very much because I'm sure it's a little boring. I ended up speaking to 18 participant pairs. It was very important to me that, if possible, that the young person, the young adult, so between 17 and 30 was my age group, was present at the interview if possible. So even though I'm speaking with people who generally are non-verbal or have significant intellectual impairments, I really wanted in some way to have them at the centre of the project. And I felt that just talking to parents and decision makers was not a very good start. So despite the fact it took me 9 months to get ethical clearance, I ended up getting it, and it was a really valuable part of the project. I also drew on my own lived experience, and yeah, it questioned whether or not the project is actually inclusive, because it is very difficult to do real inclusive work with people with PIMD. But I kind of made a good whack at it. And in fact, this picture is from a day when my daughter Dale came with me to do an interview because our her support worker was sick. So I brought her with me to the interviews, and in retrospect, that was a really valuable experience. And since then, Dale and I have actually co-presented parts of this work together, as a way to just increase her visibility, particularly in the area of intellectual disabilities, where the people with the most profound impairments can be a little bit invisible. Yeah, so that's what I did. And the way I'm approaching just the last little bit of this talk is to try and give a picture using the words of the people I spoke to. So I ended up speaking entirely to parents, which I think is a product of trying to reach people who are decision makers who are going to agree to speak to me for an hour or an hour and a half. And it was also not really feasible for me to go into more kind of controlled or institutional type settings where someone did not have a decision maker who was connected to them personally. So for example, they may have an appointed guardian. It was just a whole other kettle of fish to get into those populations. And I'd very much like to as a next step, but this was, I was open to speaking to anyone, but I got parents, which is not probably terrifically surprising to this group. And in fact, a lot of work is done with parents in this kind of area. So Charlotte, I love this quote, says, when her son turned 18, we were shoved off the pier in a little boat. We were on our own. It all happens at once. There's no easing into it. It's just, there you go, thanks, bye. And that's just the way it is. And I think really this was the experience of everyone who I spoke to. And this represents the scope of the transition to adulthood for these families, these young people and their decision makers, that it involves all aspects of their life and a number of wide-ranging and complex decisions, usually in environments where the administrative or legal body has not given much thought to how people may be able to negotiate with the system on behalf of someone else. So the idea of legal autonomy is so baked into all of our kind of social and cultural institutions that often the options for people who may have severe impairments in their capacity to communicate and understand is almost invisible. So I think that really summed it up. And of course, it's leaving school, it's leaving the children's health system, which can be very significant for people, as I'm sure a lot of the CP Achieve researchers and participants know, that it really is a casting off and you're on your own. So one of the key areas that people deal with is, of course, income support and Centrelink. I have a fantastic quote here. Some of the elements of that interaction involves the difficulties of proving eligibility, even though people clearly have profound disabilities and have often gone through a process of proving that to government in other contexts. They front up to each institution and again are asked to go through that process. So there's no universal kind of identity, which is not that you want to issue everyone a card going, oh, hey, I'm disabled. That is not what I'm saying. I'm more saying that you can't use, for example, your NDIS eligibility to share with Centrelink to establish your eligibility for a disability support pension. You can't necessarily, like, this happens at around the age of 16, where young people become independently eligible for a pension. So people aren't under guardianship at that age, but it's not necessarily sufficient for a parent to be able to assert that someone lacks the capacity to sign a form, for example. Often people are put through job readiness, and this is kind of an internal process where they assess whether or not someone can work. And obviously that assessment is wildly inappropriate for people who can't, for example, tell you that they want a drink of water or that their leg is broken, let alone that they're not going to be able to participate in job readiness. And I had a number of people describe this kind of situation where Belinda, the mother of Andrew, had to take him to a job readiness assessment where it was clear immediately that this was inappropriate due to his inability to participate in this at all. But it was still a significant obligation on her and on her son to go through, otherwise they wouldn't get to the next stage of Centrelink. So it creates these kind of additional burdens on families where, other than the profound disability that their children already have, they would not be going through this already. So it just is that added extra something. These are all pseudonyms, by the way. I'm not using people's real names. So yeah, I think that sums up the idea of both eligibility and the appropriateness of dealing with people in this cohort. Leaving school is significant. A couple of great quotes here that echo that: out in a boat, you get your 12 to 13 years, then it just stops. And Alison describes the school system as a bubble. So here in Queensland, there's a special school system, and all of the children who I interviewed had been through that system. Generally here, it's for more severe disabilities. And she speaks of it as a bubble, so that you might have a class with a teacher aide, and the support is one-on-one, you have carers, you have a bus, it's all funded. And then when they finish, that's it. You're on your own. And that can be a significant shock to people. I have another slide coming up where it's referred to as the second shock. The first shock is diagnosis, and the second is moving into adulthood and out of those systems where support is perhaps better integrated and provided for people with this kind of disability. This is my picture of Anthony Green, who I'm unashamed fangirl. I looked at voting, which in Queensland is still under the provision that someone is of unsound mind. So let's just pause there and I don't know, feel bad that that's still what it's called. Here, interestingly, people had quite an easy time, but often described that as problematic, in that you could just fill out a form reporting someone as being of unsound mind and unable to vote. And often people would just call on the phone and that, oh, that's okay, we'll take them off the roll. And really, given that that's your fundamental right as a citizen in society, that's quite problematic as well. So here, Jane spoke about, all I did was ring up, and that she didn't have to fill any forms. And then on reflection, as I asked about it, she went, oh, actually, that's a bit of a problem. Very briefly, banking. Banking actually emerged as a significant problem for all of the people I spoke to. And that is because, in my opinion, legally speaking, banking is heavily based on individual autonomy. It has almost no recognition of relationship in terms of who is responsible for the bottom line being literally dollars. So when it comes to someone who may be unable to communicate or unable to sign or clearly unable to manage money, there are very few options available, and nearly everybody were not satisfied with their current banking options. So they'd been unable, for example, to get a card with a chip in it so that you can use direct debit or make purchases online. They'd been unable to even get a kind of debit card. People were still using passbook accounts. A lot of people had kind of gone around that. For example, what we did, which is we have accounts in my name, which is technically not legal. Or people would make accounts online with an online bank such as ING and just not mention that their child didn't have legal capacity. And in fact, 3 people had ended up going to get guardianship solely on the basis of banking. And given the current trend of not requiring people to get guardianship, and the sometimes significant obligations that can put on decision makers, that is very problematic. There are a lot of decisions made at the face-to-face level, so people who didn't have a lot of knowledge about banking's obligations to provide products and services that do not discriminate based on a person's level of intellectual disability. So this was a significant problem, and something that I actually solely just do a 30-minute presentation just on banking, because it is a really big issue and it has profound effects. This is people's lives. You need a bank account to get paid the pension. You need a bank account for your NDIS funding to be put into. And there are significant gaps between our anti-discrimination legislation, our human rights legislation here in Queensland, and our broader human rights obligations under the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities. And I think banks and financial services have a long way to go. Here, Belinda again talks about her son Andrew being made to put a dot on a piece of paper, and that was therefore going to satisfy the obligations of the bank to show that he understood, even though this was clearly a ridiculous requirement and added nothing, and in my opinion as a lawyer would provide no legal protection to anyone whatsoever. So it was quite an interesting experience, and certainly echoed the experiences my own family had had with banking. Okay, very briefly, because I'm mindful of leaving some time for questions, the NDIS. Again, I could talk for an hour about the NDIS and the intricacies of how they deal with people in relationship with other people, so decision makers and family members, and how they deal with people with profound disabilities. And the NDIS has a long way to go, but it is important to recognise that everyone who I spoke to was better off under the NDIS. And we're talking here about profoundly disabled people with multiple types of disabilities. So I'm not saying the NDIS has been great for everybody. We know that that's not necessarily true. But for this group of people with the very severe and profound disabilities, people were often, I think it was described as some people were up to 10 times better off in terms of the amount of funding they had access to, as opposed to under the state system. So it was a very much a, it's fantastic, which I've got a couple of quotes there about people saying, I've never known what freedom was, and there's hope now, which is really kind of both exciting and sad. But I always say it's the NDIS is great, but, and then the but would lead to a lot of conversation about how to deal with an agency that is encouraging people to take choice and control when your young person perhaps can't express that themselves. Well, in fact, they can't express that themselves. And it's an increasingly unknown bureaucratic system. It's very difficult to balance those competing needs. And one of the particular things that I found was a lack of expertise inside the system. And I wrote a paper on this, and I'm happy to update people with a citation for, which was around needing expertise around profound, complex disabilities. So there is a complex needs stream, but that tends to be people who have other institutional ties. For example, maybe moving in and out of corrections, or had been under a child protection system. It is not necessarily for people whose disabilities are complex. And there's no particular policy or guideline for people, making sure that people with very high value dollar plans have more access and better service in terms of internal agency capacity, having well-trained planners who are consistent across the life of a plan, who have financial delegation and who can answer complex questions about high cost material, home modifications, all the bits and pieces that people need when they have high mobility needs, high support needs, overnight caring needs, they need continence support, enteral feeding support, and there just isn't a great provision at the moment for that very kind of high needs group. And that was certainly something that came out in my work. And here Alison describes the fact that her daughter was not funded at the correct level, the hourly rate support level, and kind of saying how ridiculous that was. She's nonverbal, she has seizures, she's peg fed, she's incontinent, she can't push her own chair, and yet she was assessed at not being in the high intensity one-on-one level of per hour funding, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. That's my slide on the second shock, which is about the last year of school, feeling like you're in a boat alone on the ocean. And I'm conscious that I'm running out of time a little bit. And I've still got a couple more slides, but I am just going to very briefly talk about my two main concepts, which are that we need to recognise profound difference. That is, we need to recognise that there are people who have profound intellectual disabilities, and that's okay. And it's part of the human experience, and who they are and what they are capable of is enough. It's not about job readiness and education. There is just a group of people for whom that is not appropriate. And we really need to think about how, as a society, we help people rather than hinder them. And that's about reducing the silos between all of our administrative systems, improving our recognition of people who care and provide support for those people, and just providing better integrated support and services. And here I'm trying to capture with these quotes the confronting level of intellectual disability. It can be confronting for people to accept. For example, my own daughter could not tell us that she had broken her leg. And if you just sit with that, yes, we could see through her behaviours that something was wrong, but it is such a difference between other types of intellectual disability and that really profound impairment. And there is such a need for just an honest recognition of that in all of our systems, including in disability advocacy and awareness. And the second part, and I will stop after this, is the idea of what I've called radical dependence. That is, in all of our systems, both socially, funding, and most importantly, administrative and legal, which makes all of this work, we need to recognise that people exist inside relationships. Not everyone has the luxury of these relationships, and I'm fully aware of that. But for those who do, we need a better way of recognising that you may be making decisions as a family, or you may be making decisions as a group, or you may be making decisions with a parent or a sibling or a grandparent, or you may be making decisions with a circle of support, and that should be able to be formally recognised when you're banking, when you're dealing with Centrelink, when you're dealing with the NDIS, that there's some way to not require an individual to take responsibility, stepping away from the idea of just get a guardian to sign that, and thinking more holistically about how people actually live in their lives inside relationships. And my argument is we need this not just for people with profound disabilities, but we need it for all kinds of groups. Family banking. Why can't families have a bank account and allow their children to use that account in certain situations? Why can't couples? I mean, we recognise individual couples can join together, but we don't easily kind of say, yes, you as a group can have a bank account. And anyone who's been on a PNC or in a voluntary organisation would recognise we need to see relationships inside our legal relationships to each other. And it's a real gap in Western legal ideas. And I guess I'm, in a small way, asking that maybe we could just think about that a little more effectively, and it would really make the lives of people who are totally dependent on others for every aspect of their legal and administrative lives, it would make their lives a lot easier too. So that's probably all I'm going to actually say. I feel like I've gone way beyond time, but there's so much exciting stuff to say, and just the people who I spoke to were just wonderful. And I do want to recognise that that unfortunately Alison's daughter Mary passed away this year. So I do want to say an in memoriam to her and her amazing contribution to this work. But yeah, I'm happy to have questions. I do have a couple of more slides, but that was from a different bit that I'd added on. I'm just going to skip to my details. Apparently, they're my supervisors, and Dale, and memoriam of Mary, Alison's daughter.